Good morning. There are like 5 of you here, come back from coffee. I feel like we should just sit in a little circle and talk to each other. I'm Jennifer, and we're going to talk today about the change outside us and what that means for the change inside us. And I, unfortunately, do not speak your beautiful language, so I'm hoping that you speak mine, or else this will be a very non-communicating sort of session. Are we good? Excellent. So let's start with a question. I want you to think about, when you think about the way grown-ups grow, and you think about maybe something we would call development on one axis, and something we would call age on another axis, what shape would you draw there? I want you to talk to your neighbor, maybe sketch a shape on your pad of paper, and talk to your neighbor about what shape you would draw and why you would draw that shape. Talk to each other. Okay, I'm seeing lots of people draw shapes in the air. Yeah. Shapes like this, and shapes like this, and shapes like this. I'm seeing lots of shapes in the air. How many of you had a shape that looked kind of like that? Yeah, some people are nodding. Yeah, I see some hands up. Yeah. So this has been the kind of way people have thought about adult growth and development for a lot of human history. Right? Mostly they were thinking adults grew a lot early in their lives, right? We go to school, we kind of invest in the growth of young people, and then we're kind of steady, and then we hit a decline, right? So this has been kind of the story of adult growth for many years. Even it's still how most universities organize their developmental psychology. They talk about kids and child development, and then there's kind of a quiet time, and then they talk about aged development and decline. This is kind of the story. It's not that happy a story, though, right? It kind of looks like a big frown. And if somebody comes into your office and they say, I'm really thinking about what my next steps are, and this person is kind of 50 years old, and you have this theory in mind, you don't have that much to say to this person. Like, get a hobby, do something useful with your declining years. It's not a very good, not a very pleasant conversation. But it turns out that over the past 50 years, people have been studying the way adults really grow and change over time. And they've come up with a picture that looks a lot more like this. How many of you had a picture that looked like this, or something like this? A couple people tracing in the air. Yeah. So here, this idea is that in this world, we actually get more of something as we grow. We don't just kind of plateau and decline. We actually are growing something. And so when the 50-year-old walks into your office, actually you've got a pretty good story to say, right? The future years, this development of something we might think of as wisdom, is still in front of you. And there's something gorgeous about that. And something very important for human potential, human capital and potential. But the question is, what is this thing that we're talking about? And it turns out that the world brings at us these things, complexity, ambiguity, change. How many of you have felt a rise in your life in complexity, ambiguity, and change in the last 5 years? Yeah, it's like very common right now. The world is changing so fast. And it turns out that pattern those graphs describe is about our capacity to deal with these things. How do we get not just better at coping, but actually more spacious, more able to handle these things? And that changes over time. And for some people it grows, and for some people it doesn't grow. And so then the question is, what is the growth and what makes the difference? That's what we're going to talk about. What is the growth and what makes the difference? Okay, you up for that conversation? Thank you. So here's the way psychologists are starting to think about what grows over time. It's actually the world we live in and the way we understand and make sense of the world that changes. I want you to think back and see if you remember a time in your life when actually most of what you learned, most of what you knew about the world came from people outside you. The way you knew whether you were successful or not, the way you knew whether you were on the right career path, the way you knew whether you were doing your job right. Do you remember a time when you knew that by asking somebody, how am I doing? How am I doing? Is this the right way to be? What should my next step be? Do you remember a time like that? Yeah. So humans go through this place, we call it the socialized form of mind, because we get socialized into a group or a surround. And it's an incredibly important and beautiful way to be in the world. It lets me link arms with another person and say, we're in this together. And I will put the needs of us in front of the needs of just me. And that's a beautiful thing. For a complex world, though, it's tricky because who's the person or the group you want to invest with that kind of power to write your story? It used to be that there was somebody you could turn to, and that person could tell you, do it like this, a good parent looks like this, a good worker looks like this, a good partner looks like that. Those guides are going these days. And so for some people, they start to say, wait, it's too confusing to have the world out there describing me. I need to bring this into myself. And I can't be written by the world. I need to write my own story somehow. And so we talk about that as the self-authored world. And some people kind of expect that this move from the socialized to the self-authored space is very quick. Like first you're a manager and somebody tells you what to do, and then you become a leader, and then you set the vision for yourself. But actually, it's not quick at all. And there's one more piece to this story. Sometimes some people realize, wait, I am not the only author of my story. You're important in my story too. You're not just a character. You actually write the story with me. You write it and I write it, and I write your story too. We're written by the context as much as we are writing the context. And those people are able to live in complexity very easily. And we call that the self-transforming form of mind because the world changes them. They're sort of the ultimate in the agile person. And they go back and forth in the world as they learn and grow and change every day. Another way to think about it is to imagine that earlier in our life, we kind of see the world with very few grays. There's black, there's white, there's gray. And as we grow, we get more capacity to see gray and nuance until later on we actually understand that there's no difference between black and white. They're the same thing. It's all a continuum that's created by one entity. Does that make sense? You with me? So what does this have to do with leadership? I'd love you to turn to your partner that you were just drawing graphs with in the air and have just a minute's conversation about, so what does this have to do with leaders and organizations? This little theory here. Talk to each other. Okay, I'm going to interrupt your good conversations. And I want us to take this conversation and we're just going to put it here. And I want us to imagine together how these forms of mind look in a leadership context, right? So this is from one study. There are a bunch of other small studies I can point you to. It's a relatively new field of study. But I want you to think to yourself, so if you weren't yet at that first form of mind I described, the socialized form, how do you think you would show up as a leader? Where do you think you would be on this graph? Were you guessing there? Seeing a couple of heads nod. What about if you were kind of in that socialized place where I get my cues about the outside world, about what to do from the outside world? Where would you show up there? Would you guess that? How about if I'm now growing, getting bigger and bigger, moving from the socialized world to the self-authored world, but I'm still kind of straddling between those two places? What do you think happens to my leadership effectiveness? It straddles too, right? Sometimes one way, sometimes the other way. If I pull this foot up and I stand strong in the self-authored space, what does that look like? Interesting, right? Not as big a jump as I would have thought. The surprise to most of this research, most of the studies that people are doing with this theory in leadership is this jump, which is that the self-transforming space seems for some reason to be more suited, particularly during times of change, to lead to really excellent leadership. And so leadership effectiveness, particularly during times of complexity and change, seems to require this very sophisticated way of making sense of the world. But let's see what the world has to offer, right? So if you think about how many people might be distributed across these different places, this is how many adults aren't yet in the socialized space. Like they haven't arrived there yet. This is how many adults are in the socialized space, which gives us this many in the self-authored space. And remember that big step up in leadership effectiveness? That's for that little tiny pie slice. So the question for us, I think, who care about people and organizations, the question for us who care about leadership, who care about bringing the world into a better place, is how do we help people grow, right? How many of you are having a question right now like, oh, how might we help people move from one place to another? Anybody engaging in that question in their heads right now? Yeah, I've engaged with that question in my head for a long time. So I have some thoughts about it. But here's the thing. I love this cartoon. Would you like to hear tonight's specials, or have you already closed yourselves to new experiences? So the thing is that growing is hard. Right? The reason people don't do it is not because people believe that they shouldn't. It's because growing is hard, and organizations, which are the places where most adults spend most of their lives, their waking lives, organizations are the places where people could be growing more. But often organizations are places where people are sort of pushed back and not growing at all. So my partner Keith Johnston and I came up with this set of ideas that's based on a particular kind of development. So how many of you have heard the difference between horizontal development, which is where you learn more stuff? Like we all know how to do that. You learn more stuff. You learn how to do a new computer program. You learn a new language. You learn new stuff. And vertical development, where you actually change who you are, right? You deal with the stuff you know in brand new ways. How many of you have ever heard this distinction? So it's getting kind of popular, this distinction. It's starting to advance in the organizational world. And this question is, how do we support people to not just learn more stuff? We know how to do that. But to grow in this vertical way, to become new in some way at work. What do we do? How do we do that? So Keith and I came up with a way that's built on this fundamental motion of growth. And I'm going to tell you a little story before I get to what that is. How many of you have ever been to the Grand Canyon? Oh, that's a bunch. That's more than I was expecting. What did you think? What'd you think? Big. What else? What else was it like? Vertical. It was very vertical, isn't it? Yes. What else? What else is the Grand Canyon like? I'm sorry? It's very changeable, isn't it? Yeah. So I took my family to the Grand Canyon when they were little. We had long ago moved from the US, and we had become kind of, in our small village in New Zealand where we raised our children, we had become kind of the tourism guide for the US, because people were always asking us questions about where do we go in the US. And people kept asking us about the Grand Canyon. We had never been. So one holiday, we took our kids to the Grand Canyon. Aiden was probably 6 at the time. How many of you have spent time with a 6-year-old boy? Oh, I don't believe you. How many of you have spent time with a 6-year-old boy? I would think so. What are they like? What's your 6-year-old boy like? Playing. Yeah, what else? Curious. Yeah, what else? I'm sorry? These kids are dangerous, actually, right? Like a 6-year-old boy is a dangerous thing. And we were walking down into the Grand Canyon. And the Grand Canyon, the thing that people didn't say is that it's actually very scary, right? It's very beautiful, it's very grand, it's very vertical, but it's very frightening. There are no walls. And it just goes down forever. And here I am with my little 6-year-old. And he's like running ahead, and he's kicking the stones off. And he's running up to the mules. There are mules, and he's trying to pet the mules. Like, he's all over the place. And I realized as I watched him that I was keeping my eyes totally fixed on his backpack. Right? Like, he had this little red backpack on, and I was keeping my eyes totally fixed on that little red backpack, as though I had, like, superpower mom eyes that were gonna keep him from falling off the cliff. And every once in a while, I would watch myself doing this. I would see me pretending I had superpower mom eyes. And when I did that, I could take a breath, and I could say, like, does Aiden need me to watch him right now? And when I could ask that question, who should I be for Aiden right now, I could make a choice about whether I actually wanted to see the Grand Canyon, which is the point of going to the Grand Canyon, right? This is not the point of going to the Grand Canyon. And I share this story because every leader I've ever worked with has a little red backpack that they're focused on at work that takes their time and their attention, and they don't notice, they don't think about it, they just do that thing, and they miss the point of their organization or their purpose or the reason for being on the planet, which is something much more magnificent generally than just that little tiny moment in time. How many of you can think of something that might be a red backpack for you right now? Does anybody have that? Yeah. The rest of you are like too busy in your red backpack to even raise your hands right now. So it's this motion, actually, this motion about who am I being right now, and can I watch myself and then make a choice instead of thoughtlessly just doing the thing that my anxiety makes me do? Can I watch me and choose? This is the motion of growth, right? Like, this is ultimately the thing that creates this thing called vertical development. And there are some habits that we can help people develop that support them to have more of this motion in themselves, in their everyday work lives. And it creates this kind of great cycle, because the more you use the habits, the more you grow, and the more you grow, the more you use the habits. So it's kind of cool. And we can actually work these into our workplaces on a daily basis. We can work them into our home lives, into our fun lives, whatever we want to do on a daily basis. And as we do that, we begin to grow. There are 3. You ready for them? You have to say yes, or I'm not going to tell you. Yes? Okay. The first one is this one. It's about asking different questions. So many of us ask questions, but they're the questions we're always asked. We just ask the same questions. And a lot of the questions that particularly leaders ask are not actually questions at all. Like, did you talk to legal before you issued that press release? That is not a question, right? That is a command or a test, but it's not a question. I want you to think about who in your life asks you the questions that really make you think in a new way about the world. I'm sorry? Kids, is that what you said? Like the number one response around the world to that question is our kids make us think in new ways. Little kids, like, why do you even do that? Like, who even cares about this organization thing? Why does anybody even care about that? What do you do all day? All these questions, they're not better questions than the questions you carry, but they're different. And different questions, like the ones you can grab from each other, the ones you learn from people up here, the ones you read in books, carrying a new question helps us think in new ways. Here's the next habit. Taking multiple perspectives. I want you to think about, is there somebody in your life for whom you could be a better listener and take their perspective more fully without trying to convince them that your perspective is right? How many of you can think of somebody in your life that you could do that with? Yeah. And then the question is, what could you learn? Right? What would you learn if you actually took and held that person's perspective? And we can all get better at this over time, right? This is a habit we can all be exercising. Here's the third one. So here in this kind of beautiful picture, what do you see in this beautiful picture? A hurricane. What else? Australia. What else? You see the sea? Yeah. Many people kind of think this looks like a painting, like something, a kind of impressionistic painting. Here you see forces, right? You see things that are going faster. You see things that are maybe interconnected, like this hurricane above New Zealand and that one over off the tip of Australia. You see what creates these patterns. You can see what seems to make the hurricane stronger. Seems to be water. And what makes it weaker seems to be land, right? Australia's giant. And so this is all a piece of seeing systems. Weather is the most studied complex system on the planet. But we also have complex systems in our teams, in our families, in our organizations. And they all have these same patterns, like what makes things go faster, put more energy in? What sucks the energy out? What things might we think are connected that don't initially appear to be connected? These are questions we can ask ourselves if we start seeing systems. And so we can ask ourselves, when am I looking at kind of simple cause and effect, as though it was just a very straightforward thing? And when can I be pulling back to look at relationships, forces, interactions? And then I know that I'm working with a system. So those are the three habits, and they're simple to talk about, but they're kind of hard to do. But they're actually easy to work into team meetings. They're easy to work into our daily lives. When do I need to take a new perspective? Who has a new question that might be helpful for me? And how am I not looking at the system here? And the thing is that it's these things that help us grow. William James said, most people live in a very restricted circle of their potential being. They make use of a very small portion of their possible consciousness, much like a man who out of his whole bodily organism should get into a habit of using and moving only his little finger. When we think about the complex challenges which face us now, the idea that we might be walking through the world and instead of using our whole possibility, we're using just our little finger to get things done, like that is a very potent metaphor, I think. And so the invitation for us is to figure out, How are we growing? And how can we support other people to grow in new ways? And this is what I hope that I've been able to help you with in our tiny little amount of time today. If you're still curious, there are some books that I have written. There's a blog that I have. I talk about these things. And if you would like this in a better language, I happen to have recently had a wonderful human being who's translated this book into Czech, this first book about which I was just speaking, into Czech. So I will be around this afternoon with him, and we will, Tomáš and I will answer questions that you have.